My name is Precious Benali. I am the Associate Director for the Tribal Youth Resource Center at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Thank you for taking time out of your day to attend this wonderful online learning event on the screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. Probably from here on out, we'll be referring to it as SBIRT for Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts. I am joined by Evan Elkin. He is the Executive Director of Reclaiming Futures. He's originally from Vermont, but currently lives in Portland, Oregon with his wife and son. And a little about Evan before he joins us. He is a leader in the field of juvenile justice reform, adolescent and family mental health, and substance abuse treatment and youth development. Originally, Evan trained as a psychologist at New York University and a researcher at the New York Psychiatric Institute, as well as Columbia University's Department of Child Psychiatry. Evan has worked extensively in both tribal and non-tribal youth justice settings, in schools and in child welfare, helping to advance public health, equity, and social justice through innovation and the development of evidence-based practices. So for the past 2 decades, he has been his work has been at the intersection of public health and social justice, focusing on the nation's most vulnerable populations. And as you'll find out, Evan is the author of several adaptations of SBIRT for adolescents, families, and tribal communities. So welcome, Evan. But before he comes on, I want to tell you a little about, this is me, my picture, and here is Evan. One of the downfalls of having webinars and online learning events is that you tend to not be able to see folks. So as we go through this, you can match our voices with our pictures. So a little about us here at the Tribal Youth Resource Center. We are the training and technical assistance provider for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We bring an in-depth understanding and appreciation of American Indian and Alaska Native history, customs, and indigenous justice systems. We work from a foundation that our children are sacred. Everything we do, we keep that as our focus. We try to be mindful of who we are serving, and to make sure that we bring in the community's values and understanding to this work. We can be found at tribalyouth.org. We offer free training and technical assistance to both OJJDP-funded grantees as well as federally recognized tribes. Our work supports tribal youth programs and juvenile healing to wellness courts. So if you're familiar with CTAS, we engage with both Purpose Area 8 and Purpose Area 9 grantees. And again, we are funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Any of our resources and anything we talk about, especially for an archived recording of this presentation, can be found at tribalyouth.org. We're going to be bringing this website up a lot over the course of this presentation, because if you are interested in learning more about the work Evan has done or would like to receive technical assistance related to SBIRT or adapting evidence-based practices in your court or your program, you can fill out a referral or a training and technical assistance request form. It's going to be found again at www.tribalyouth.org. Presentation. If you have any questions at all, we encourage you to submit the questions through the chat box there, and you can say hello. You can ask questions. I will try to interrupt Evan as we go if you have questions throughout the presentation. So we want to make this as participatory as we can. And most importantly, you can download all online learning event handouts, including today's PowerPoint slides, under the Files bar. You can also see Evan's bio, and he'll probably talk about this, but he and his organization created a publication detailing the work that he's done with Yurok and Southern Ute. So, yes, Evan, take it away.
All right, Precious, thank you so much for that nice introduction and saying a few things about my career. And I think while it is true that I feel, some creative authorship to some of the work that we've done, particularly in tribal communities, I feel like it's a little unfair to say that I am the author, and you'll hear a little bit about why I feel that way as we talk about this work that we've done and the importance that I place on the collaboration that we've done in communities, both tribal and non-tribal, to help co-create and collaborate to build practices and policies and ideas that are resonant locally, and to really grant authorship to my partners in those communities. So it's been a privilege to take part in that. So today's presentation is going to focus on an aspect of our work at Reclaiming Futures, and I'll say a word about what Reclaiming Futures is in a second. But an aspect of our work that has been important to us and seems in a very practical way, but also, as you'll hear me talk about, a very philosophical way. Question about how we ask the right questions of young people and how we determine how it is that we want to help them or can help them, and the tools that we use is not a small matter. The way that we do it is critically important in setting a certain tone, and I want to talk about that throughout the presentation. So the title of my talk today is Honoring the Power of Culture in Building Effective Screening and Intervention Practices. And clearly what we mean by culture in this particular discussion has a lot to do with tribal communities and the culture and the power that is often lost or misplaced in the process of building justice practices, but also any community. And I see from the list, I don't know if you guys can see this, but as a presenter on this webinar, I get to see who's on, and I see lots of friends and colleagues from settings that are both tribal and non-tribal that I've worked with in the past, so it's nice to see some familiar names and faces here. So these are the things I'm going to talk about, the importance of culture and heritage, specifically from a public health framework. And I'll stop here to say a word about Reclaiming Futures. We have been around for about 20 years now, and we came into being with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation 20 years or more ago. And if you know who that foundation is, you'll know that their practice and the funding that they've primarily been involved with over the years has to do with health and wellness. And in some ways, the way the story is told, before I became the director of Reclaiming Futures, which I've been for 4 very exciting years now, the foundation was dragged kicking and screaming into the field of juvenile justice. As a health and wellness foundation, a lot of their programs and grant making have to do with community health and wellness, the kinds of things in communities like schools that prevent negative health outcomes. And they initially didn't see the connection between the public health perspective, which, as you'll hear from me, in my view, is a community perspective. And it's very strongly a culturally driven and community-driven perspective. And I think at the very beginning, people were confused about what the heck that has to do with youth justice. And I know from who I see on the call that many of you know the answer to that question, and that's what we're going to get into. So we're going to talk about the importance of culture and heritage, particularly tribal heritage, and how that fits into this public health framework that we are very much involved in promoting at Reclaiming Futures, but which is also, as you'll hear if you're not familiar with it, it's a natural way that we think about health and wellness and the terms we use to describe health and wellness and how we think about maintaining it, preventing it, promoting it, etc. Going to talk a lot about the difference between sort of the traditional and highly structured ways that we think about screening. And if you are in a court setting, and we'll find out in a second who is where and what roles they play, you know that screening tools are very much an increasingly big part of how we practice. It's a structured way of finding out who needs what kind of help. But I'm going to talk about a different lens on that screening process, a different way of looking at screening that opens doors to some of the community and cultural elements and some of the strengths and collaborative relationship possibilities that lie ahead when you sit down across the table from a young person, and how shifting the lens on how, why, and the what in terms of what tool you use, how that affects the relationship and the future collaboration you might have with that young person as it unfolds in front of you, and where you face a choice of opening sometimes a very positive and motivated door, or how you can sometimes inadvertently close a door right away by being insensitive to those cultural elements. And I'm going to specifically talk about the value of this new lens for court programs, which is a lot of where Reclaiming Futures has worked. It's where our tribal work has focused so far, but also translates for us. And if there's time and people are interested, we can talk about our school-based work. We talk about how we have used this new understanding of screening and brief intervention, a more collaborative approach to screening, how we've used that in schools and some new work that we're doing. And then getting specific to describe the story of some of the actual work that we've done, I'm going to talk about our projects that we've been involved in with the Yurok Indians in Northern California and the Southern Ute tribe in Colorado. And some of that work, as Precious pointed out, is outlined in this new practice brief. We haven't released it yet, so this is a preview copy that you all get to see. You can download it in your resources window on the screen. I'm not sure what your screen looks like to you, but I see it down in the close to the lower right side of the screen. You can download that PDF document. Sort of describes our work so far in tribal communities. So even though I started, I think probably the best way to start is for us to get a sense of who's in the room and who we're talking to. And I've seen a nice stream of folks writing in the chat box, and I encourage you to do that. I see folks I know. Hi, Judge Marcel in St. Charles, Louisiana. Say hello in the chat box if you can. Let's see folks I know. Hi, Bridget. And just say hello. Let us know where you're from. You know, whatever you want to say. I'm curious to know what excited you about getting on this call. And we also have a poll, as you can see, that has now popped up on the screen, which has to do with letting us know what your role is in your community. Are you a judge, probation officer? Do you work for a treatment provider, or are you a counselor, a provider of therapeutic or healing intervention with young people? Are you in the community, working for a community-based organization, serving youth? Do you direct a court program, perhaps a healing to wellness court? And there may be other roles. If there's a role that I missed, please feel free to write it into the chat box. And I think it's important for us to understand, you know, that the work that we do really requires a team effort, and this is a really, you know, multidisciplinary effort and includes the community. And I'm very pleased to see that there are, you know, quite a few folks from community-based organizations on the call here. I see we have an education consultant at the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. We've got got quite a few probation officers. So we'll let this, we'll let the poll run for a little bit, and then in a minute I'll have Laura or Precious kind of tabulate the results. I see we have somebody from all the way up in Alaska, the Native Council up there. Very cool. Wow, nice geographical representation. I wish we were all actually in a room together. We do the best we can. We do the best we can with the webinar format and to make it personal and to connect with each other, but it's preferable to be in the room. Okay, why don't we, looks like maybe most folks have answered the poll. If anyone wants to quickly jump into the poll and tell us what your role is, do it now, and then in a minute, Laura, maybe you can post the results for everybody. Okay, so a nice balance of folks from different roles, and it seems like the majority of folks are actually working in the community, which is a very positive thing. You'll hear a little bit about why I think that's positive as we proceed. And quite a few project directors too. Okay, so can we? I'm seeing the poll in the center of the slide portion of the screen. I don't know if others are. Maybe we can have that moved, Laura, so we can get to the rest of the slides. There we go. So, as Precious pointed out, I'm a psychologist by training and spent the first part of my career working in a community mental health clinic in New York City, in a neighborhood that is it's called Washington Heights, sometimes called Spanish Harlem. And after working, all of the years, to get my graduate degree and working in the field, I really had an eye-opening experience working in that neighborhood, which was a largely Hispanic, Caribbean, and African American community, and realizing that not a darn thing that I learned in graduate school prepared me for the kind of strength and power and engagement that resided in those communities. And that was my second education, took place by working in those communities. So I will advance the slide now. So I've made reference to this concept of the public health perspective and the public health lens. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that, just to establish a base of understanding for our conversation today. And in the translation of the PowerPoint file into the format for this webinar, you'll see on your screen that some of the text didn't fit into the graphics and is rolled over, but I think you'll be able to see what is intended in those, and our apologies for that technical glitch. So the way that I think of the public health lens, and I've put it in the form of a circle or a wheel here because I do think that it's circular and not linear. And then I'll start at the top, however. When we talk about this concept of the social determinants of health, which is kind of a buzzword that's used in the field of public health, but what it really means is culture and community and the strengths and assets that reside naturally in the places where we live, that are structural to how we live, but also are somewhat more intentional in some ways. It's about the norms for wellness that we communicate in our communities, that we believe, the things we believe about what it means to be a good person and a well person in a community. Whether your concept of wellness and health has to do with connectedness to others in your community, or whether your view of health and wellness is that you're strong and growing as a kid on the right trajectory. So it's the beliefs that we have about wellness and the norms that we establish in a community, and it's also the elements and assets. So it's it's family. It's multi-generational family that lives together in proximity, may be an important determinant of health and wellness in one community. And when that is disjointed or disrupted, that can become a risk factor, which is a term that we all use. So thinking about community and the building blocks of the way the systems go together, the availability of good education services, the availability of good fresh food, all of those things that we sometimes think of as just second nature and that we don't notice unless they're gone. Those are the social determinants of health. And those things are much more important to how I think about the work that we do in court systems, increasingly so as my work in the field has advanced. And you'll hear a little bit about why. And I'll give you a hint, is that I feel that we don't rely heavily enough on that perspective of strengthening and filling gaps in that part of how we see the big picture of public health. And then as you move a little bit, around the wheel, we think about prevention. Are there things happening in our community that we're worried about kind of in a general way? Are our kids distracted by social media and suffering stress and anxiety because of the presence of a new factor in our community? Or are young people, tempted by the availability of alcohol and drugs? And so what are the things that we do, as a baby step out of that first circle in this wheel to hedge against some of those influences? Do we up the ante with education? Do we try to stage and encourage a certain kind of conversation in a school setting so that kids have a broader consciousness and greater resiliency against some of the factors we are worried about? That's prevention. And preventive elements can become institutionalized and become part of that first circle. They can become part of the structure of what keeps us well in a community. And when we forget to do those things, we put our kids at risk. Taking a further step into more proactive and specific action, stuff that is sort of the seeming subject of this conversation, is we do screening and we assess and we triage. We see signs. We notice things. When kids are not feeling well, we notice when kids are beginning to show signs that something could be going wrong that would require them to have an intervention. We see behaviors. We see kids staying away from home and staying out. We see signs of mood and depression. And so screening is the next step in that direction, where we proactively notice things. And for me, if I were asked to define what screening is, it's a kind of noticing. It's a structured form of noticing. And we'll get into a little bit of the different views on what is screening and what are the strategies. But that is a public health practice as well, and the mosaic of public health is that we have the ability to discern problems as they're arising. And when they kind of reach a threshold, we have the ability to determine a course of action through assessment. And we make diagnoses. We say, okay, this is a depressed person, and we have some tools that we use when people are depressed. So it's a very important part of the public health circle, which leads us into treatment and intervention, which is the availability of resources to respond when we have a good sense that someone is in need of healing and or treatment. Any one of these things that I've talked about so far can be a strong resource in a community, can be completely absent from a community, and throwing this public health system into turmoil and into crisis. Communities that have no treatment resources, and I have visited those communities where they may have a pretty strong sense of norms and the support in the community around wellness, but very little in the way of responding when something goes really wrong. And I think this is often the case in rural communities. This probably goes well without saying that urban settings and rural settings, particularly where folks of color and tribal communities have been significantly divested of resources over the course of the last decades, and that the public health environment, this mosaic, is lacking in a very significant piece of this puzzle. And then when somebody is well, you've heard of the concept of recovery and communities of recovery and support, and what do you do to sustain wellness? You've had an intervention, you're back on track. What does your community do to keep everyone kind of on track? Do you have support groups? Do you have a system of not stigmatizing folks who have been through a treatment system, but welcoming them back to a community without stigma and marginalization? This is another thing we don't do particularly well in our society. Folks who have fallen off and gotten into substance use and or legal difficulty. We don't do a good job of welcoming them back into this part of the wheel, and inviting them to take advantage of those social determinants of health, the support systems that are there naturally. So you're starting to get a flavor of my social justice perspective. The public health lens is not a neutral thing from a justice standpoint, that these things are available and mobilized differentially for different communities, and can often lead to inequities and inequitable access to any one of these things, from care to prevention to an understanding of norms. Okay, next slide.
Hey, Evan, can I interject really quick?
Yeah.
Can I make sure everybody has their phones on mute? We're getting a little bit of feedback. Probably lunchtime for a few of you, so understandable if you're enjoying your meal while you're listening. But just make sure we're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you, Precious. And this was a good pause because I want to encourage folks. I have the potential in a setting like this where I don't see you looking interested in making a comment or confused to ramble on without taking the pulse of the folks listening if they want to make an input. Use the chat window to ask a question or make a comment, and both Precious and I will try to keep one eye on it, and I think Precious will keep two. And if folks want to make a comment or ask a clarifying question, I'm happy to do that now, although we'll certainly have plenty of time at the end for a conversation or for me to respond to your input. Okay, so having talked about from a systems standpoint how we view public health and showing you some hints as to how I see that framework fitting in with our work around social justice and equity, I want to talk about one slant on a visual slant on the way we think about the domains where public health happens. So starting with the biggest circle, this is our society, our larger society, and we know, particularly from the standpoint of people who are from tribal communities, that their tribal community is embedded and at times at odds and or on a continuum of integration with a larger community. And the two sets of norms, sets of prevention practices, assumptions about health and wellness, availability of resources, laws, literally funding, are not the same in the larger and in the embedded circles that I'm showing you here. So that it's important to talk about how public health operates in these different domains, but doesn't operate with complete overlap of resources. I believe really strongly, going down into the next smallest circle, that family is an extremely important place where public health is delivered, meaning where much of the support and the development of norms and the development of support and the interface with the larger culture happens. And that in many of the other systems that are playing a key role in the delivery of public health services, going down the list, schools, justice systems, child welfare systems, which I put under the umbrella of the other youth-serving systems, that we have historically done a terrible job of capitalizing on the resource that engaging families in the process can be. There's some really exciting stuff going on around the country in those places. Certain courts who have begun to do really strong gut checks on how families are engaged and how much we trust families in a process, but also how much we trust community and culture, and versus what you'll see in a second is what I'll refer to as the overfunctioning of these various youth-serving systems to deliver public health and wellness, which they're not originally designed to do. So using that framework, thinking about the risks and opportunities that lie in a multi-tiered system of public health like that in these domains. And as I've hinted at, that over-reliance on any one domain is a sign that the system is out of balance, that there's a critical balance or homeostasis involved. If it was only the family, all about the family's ability to keep people safe, healthy, educated, and it was all on them without resources, this would put an enormous amount of stress on the family system. And I think some families feel that way. We can talk about the narrative that leads a family to overfunction and to isolate from systems of support. But when I put this bullet on this slide, what I really mean is that I believe that we have, over time, begun to over-rely on systems like the juvenile justice system to both address behavioral health, but also deliver some of those elements in the community, those social determinants of health that I talked about earlier, to reconstruct those elements under the roof of a court program. The mentorship programs that we build, which in most cases are awesome, defining and delivering the ways that families should be involved and engaged in their young person's path to healing and wellness, or their path through and hopefully out of the justice system. That we've reached a point generally, and this is my little, on the soapbox a little bit and social commentary about this, is that we've allowed the youth justice systems and the child welfare systems to overfunction and play roles that without acknowledgement and a consciousness of what that has done to the other systems, which, as you can see, I believe it has disempowered the communities outside of the courtroom. That a court system, a judge, without talking specifically about a person, but the decision makers in the court setting that don't deeply believe in the power that the community has to kind of take it from there. And we call ourselves reclaiming futures, and this is what we mean. It's not about us claiming kids from families and communities. It's about community and family reclaiming the young person's path toward adulthood and wellness themselves. And that's a moment of where the system needs to understand that we have begun to overfunction in these particular domains. And I see courtrooms and certain judges, I know one or more of them are on this call right now that I know very well and have worked with, have begun to take steps to re-empower the community and think more in this public health kind of perspective. A piece of this, which is a central theme in today's presentation, is this idea that we have really underutilized and or ignored the cultural strengths that exist in the community to support youth. And not only the strengths and practices, but the ways of defining wellness and what it means for a young person to go from teenagehood to adulthood, or what it means when a person does wrong and harms somebody or an institution in the community, how it is that we make that young person accountable, but how we make the community whole after something like that has happened. And that we have ignored, and this is not just a comment about our failure to really enhance the way that tribal communities practice their own forms of justice, but it's true everywhere in non-tribal communities, is the way that we have failed to incorporate the strengths and the power that resides in communities, whether it's in the African American culture, whether it's the faith-based community, and the role that they have played in helping youth get back on track, or whether it's using cultural concepts and norms and processes to kind of jump in and take the place of some of the mainstream court practices that have not necessarily supported young people as well as we'd like them to. And then the final point is that all these domains are important and made more important by our ability to collaborate across those domains, to bring families into court conversations and decisions, and as I mentioned, to bring culture, but also to really think of ourselves not as the sole and most important deliverer of services to young people. Even though we get them in crisis, we get them when parents have thrown up their hands, and we tend to think that we have to be the hero and rescue a family. Pause again for folks to maybe drop a comment into the chat box or ask a question. Okay, do it at any time. So I'm going to jump into this specific conversation about screening, and we'll get us into our discussion of this concept of SBIRT and screening, brief intervention, and referral, and what I think that is and can be to the field, and why it has been a springboard for some powerful work with tribal communities. So screening, I'm sure everyone has experienced screening in some way without realizing that that's what it is, or go strongly without saying. When you go to your doctor's office and you get a blood pressure cuff put on your arm, and your blood pressure level is, pops up digitally now on the screen, that's a screening process. That's a structured way of gathering information about you as a person. It doesn't actually tell you much, but it is predictive. So you'll see, part of this visual that I have up here is that screening is meant to be predictive. A high blood pressure reading predicts a narrow range of things. Usually problems. So it could be that you have, sort of arterial difficulties, that it shows that you may have chronic and persistent hypertension, but it doesn't always predict what you think it does. In my case, when I go to the doctor, the very first time they put the blood pressure cuff on me, I always show high blood pressure because I have, some anxiety about going to doctors. I've never been a fan of doctors. It's not a fun visit for me, and my blood pressure is always up at the beginning. If we stop there and just use the reading without knowing my history, and my doctor does now, I have a relationship with this person now 3 years running in my new residence here in Oregon. He knows all about this. So he knows that I have this issue, and it's part of our shared narrative together. It's part of our relationship. That he knows I don't necessarily have high blood pressure, but that I come in kind of wound up. So already you're seeing my editorializing about the nature of most screening tools is that to lean solely on their predictive power really causes you to miss the whole person and to miss the story and to miss the narrative. And with a new doctor, if he didn't think to ask me the question, like, what's up with your high blood pressure, and give me the opportunity to say, oh, I actually don't think I have high blood pressure, just give it a minute, I'm just a little stressed out. If I didn't have that opportunity, then it's a whole different kind of an interaction. I mean, certainly no one would rush somebody into open heart surgery based on one screening. I don't mean to characterize the medical field as being narrow in that regard, but there are risks of using tools. They categorize people. They suggest a course of action that without getting further context, you might not necessarily get the real story. And you certainly don't get the story about the dynamics at play between a person and their environment. So screening tools as traditionally used are meant to predict, to categorize, to really surface problems. I think there's been a pretty strong movement in our field of youth justice to focus on the importance of understanding what social supports a person has, what interests and goals and aspirations, how connected they are to their culture and their community. The strength-based perspective is what I'm describing, and that's been, a big change in our field. In some ways, I think the field of youth justice has has really inserted that in a sustainable way into the way that we think in a lot of settings. So, but most screening tools are really about surfacing problems and acting on those problems. So let's contrast that to another way of looking at screening. Screening is an opportunity. Screening is an opportunity to have a person in front of you and to be a collaborator in a shared narrative about what those signs and symptoms that might have emerged in that screening process. And screening can be a blood pressure cuff. Screening can be 2 questions. It can be 1 question. Typically it's a series of questions. But do you see that as an opportunity, as a conversation starter, to collaborate and hear more from that person and their perspective about how those symptoms fit into their lives? Typically, we partition the screening step far away from the assessment step. We do screening, and based on the screening result, we send somebody somewhere else for a deeper conversation, for that deeper understanding, for that collaboration, to get a sense of the bigger picture. And that's part of the ecology of a health system, is that you can't spend a lot of time with every single kid if you have a high volume court. It's part of your partnership, say, with a treatment provider, is that we're going to send you somewhere else. But as you'll see in our view of SBIRT, and the opportunity that lies in doing a brief conversation that gets at some of these opportunities here, the opportunity to quickly engage, put into cultural context, to determine and surface the motivation that a young person might have to either become aware or more aware in an actionable way, to get some help for something, that there is a huge untapped opportunity in that very first screening step that we have decided is appropriate for that screening step and worked into our way of developing these SBIRT models I'll talk about in a bit. So this is just a screenshot and not meant to be a comment or criticism of the Indian Health Services resources on the website. When you go to the Indian Health Services website and navigate your way to a list of screening tools, these are the ones that pop up. These are standard screening instruments that are designed to get at the prediction and the likelihood of someone having a disorder or a problem with alcohol and or drugs. And the reason I put this up here is that these are in that first lens, that first definition of screening. These are predictive tools that were developed and validated on very large population sizes and are designed primarily for that predictive function and don't hold any of that relationship building, engagement. And as you can see, none of these are culturally derived or culturally created instruments. And here they are on the Indian Health Services website. So again, not a criticism, but I think it tells us that this is a gap area, and this was a gap area that we endeavored to try to fill in our work with creating tribally developed versions of screening and brief intervention. We're not the only, I think there's lots of interesting stuff out there, and I didn't include a slide with lots of the resources. I have one in a second. But if folks know of screening instruments or screening tools or questionnaires that have been developed in your own tribal setting or in others, please feel free to throw them into the chat box for others to see. I'd like to learn about ones that I'm not aware of, but this would be an opportunity for you to share what you might be aware of from your interaction with the field and whether maybe you've created one yourself. Here is an example developed by Jamie Barchis and her a youth collaborator, Baraza. It's a young person that she collaborated with in developing this tool in Fresno, California. And this is a screening tool that was specifically developed from the ground up to be resonant with and driven by cultural concepts among tribal youth. This was developed solely by them with Jamie as a facilitator. And the framework that they developed has to do with the 4 directions of north, south, east, and west, and a sense of the spirituality that might be tied to one direction. The South is seen as the emotional, the West the physical, and the North the mental as major domains of a person's kind of whole functioning. And in each of those domains, they develop these categories that they would use to inquire and interview a young person and have them create a balanced picture, or to show where there might be imbalances in this sort of ideal picture of emotional and behavioral functioning. And this is a great example of a screening tool. I can imagine myself being on the participant end of a process where someone asked me these questions, how well understood I would feel, and how, especially if you're somebody who's used to, circling through the system and has had a lot of, screening tools and questionnaires, this would be a very unique way to be spoken to talk about, these aspects of your functioning and not just a checklist of your problems. I was very inspired by this tool that Dr. Barch has created, and it inspired some of the work that we did later on with tribal communities. So let's get into the SBIRT thing a little bit and just ask the question, what is SBIRT? It's in some ways it's not new at all. SBIRT is a thing that's been around since, we've had human society, and it really goes to my conversation about what is public health. With the S being screening, and the BI is, how you respond when information is presented to you that something might be wrong with someone. And then the RT is referral to. So you get information about a young person, you interact with them, get a sense of where did the symptom come from, is there motivation for change, what are the reasons that might be underlying this, tap in a little bit to root cause, but mostly to motivate a collaboration and come up with an idea of what we do next. And we sometimes say that it's a hybrid of practices. Clearly it's about gathering information. It can have preventive function. One of our firm beliefs is that we tend to railroad kids into treatment, and they certainly don't all need treatment. I think we make a lot of assumptions about kids who are justice involved, that everybody needs a boilerplate intervention, but that something like an SBIRT process where you're gathering information, helping to mobilize and motivate a young person, and maybe mobilize and motivate their social support system, as you'll see in a minute in our two models that we created. That maybe you're also doing a kind of prevention, and you're putting into place a lighter touch, and not the kind of touch that immediately pathologizes a person, makes them feel like they're fully broken and that they need a deep-end intervention. And in many cases, that perspective is what pulls a person deeper into a system, as opposed to doing what we talked about earlier, which is trusting the young person, trusting the family and the natural supports in a community that can kind of take it from there. Is this an opportunity to maybe do that a little bit earlier and divert kids from, a track that we've built to receive services only through the courts and a deeper end fashion? We also like to say that SBIRT is a compass and not a map, and you'll see that we've created two very different versions, and very different from any of the other versions of screening and brief intervention that exist elsewhere in adult settings and in non-tribal communities. That it's really about the evocation of strengths and possible signs of difficulty, and to do that in tandem with an exploration that includes the young person, so that any signs that have emerged on a screening tool are not meaningful or not determined actionable until you have interacted with that young person and gotten their take on the process. And then some sort of a collaboration with the young person, their caregiver, other supports in the community on a course of action, rather than the typical linear, we've screened you, we've assessed you, we've diagnosed you, we're referring you to this particular course of action and this kind of therapy that we think that you need. This is intended to be deeply collaborative, and these elements can all be put into practice in very different and very creative ways, as you'll see. So I'm going to jump into talking about the Tribal Youth SBIRT project. I'll pause for a moment, see if folks want to ask a question in the chat box or make a comment at this point before we jump into the specific work on building SBIRT practice in tribal settings. Okay, quiet crowd, hopefully not asleep. So our Tribal SBIRT project was initially a collaboration between Reclaiming Futures and the Center for Court Innovation, and that's where I originally met Precious, who was working there at that time and was part of the impetus for creating the practice brief that is downloadable on here. So this was an idea that came out of conversations at the Center for Court Innovation on, what if we took this general framework, that compass that I showed you before, and took it to communities who were interested in building their own practices and started to, build something from the ground up. And it was a really exciting opportunity. And as you'll hear when I talk about the Yurok work and the collaboration with them, it was also somewhat urgent. I think in general there was a feeling in that community and in other rural tribal settings of not having resources, feeling disconnected from the youth that they were working with. And in the case of the Yurok community, there was a significant public health crisis unfolding with teen suicide. And so that's why we chose the Yurok community for this work initially. And then we have some work. It's a work in progress with the Southern Ute tribe in Colorado. I'll identify kind of where we are in the cycle of that project. We've developed a model with them, and it's just prior to our implementation stage with them, but those are the two groups we've worked with so far. So the principles of practice that we determined is this idea that we really need to do this with the stakeholders in the community themselves, and to get a sense of what are their views of public health, what do they do already, how do they view screening, what kind of practices around intaking young people into the programs that they have, that our first step would be a listening process with the community of stakeholders that they choose to bring to the table. And in the case of our work with Yurok, this was folks from all over and all walks that represent kind of when we did our survey at the beginning, there was community youth development practitioners from community-based organizations, folks from Indian Health Services, the juvenile justice folks from multiple counties, youth, and ultimately some conversations with parents. And then to focus the conversation early on the ways that cultural elements play a role or not in current practices, and what's the level of integration of important cultural concepts. I think, in this case, the Healing to Wellness Court in the Yurok community was very much reflective of their values. But they had strong jurisdictional challenges in terms of how the county dictated the way that they were to handle young people who got in trouble. And so the fit between the desire of that community from a cultural standpoint and from a pride standpoint, and how they wanted to integrate these practices, and the ways that they felt pressured by the jurisdictional piece, again, that larger circle that encircles the tribal community, was something that got talked about a lot, and that we placed as a serious priority on the table right away. It's the challenge is, how do we integrate cultural elements in a way that's satisfying and effective for you? And then to begin to have a strategic discussion of surfacing those values, the goals that they have, and how might that be integrated into practice like SBIRT. What would the questions be? How do you want the room set up? Who says what first? What is the nature of your philosophy of what you're trying to do with the screening? And begin to get concrete and practical right away. From that larger kind of town meeting style discussion on the first slide, we narrowed down to what we have called in the last couple of projects a design team. So identified a smaller cohort of stakeholders perhaps a treatment provider in both cases, had input from a judge and probation folks in the Healing to Wellness courts, and then work closely with that group to design something that fit that compass. What would the screening questions be? What is the central metaphor of this? What are we actually trying to find out about somebody? And what are the questions meant to sound like and be experienced like for the young person? And once that is designed roughly, to get some feedback on that from key community members, like tribal elders. In the case of Southern Ute, our initial model that we created with them was submitted to their culture committee for approval and for editing. And they had editorial feedback on the consistency of what we designed with their kind of cultural values and goals. And in the case of the Yurok work, we ran the model by a group of youth court participants who helped us to give feedback on the experience of participating in the screening and brief intervention. Actually, what they really did is they made me work with 3 kids I learned later were, particularly, challenging and likely to try to give me a hard time, and asked me to demonstrate this model we created so that they could observe it and take notes and watch. It was quite a fun experience. So after a draft is created and approved and fine-tuned by the appropriate folks, jump into the training and kind of short-term piloting and fine-tuning phase. I think this is true of any kind of work where you come in and tend to reframe, frame, or unearth difficulties through a process like this. You are setting yourself up for failure if you don't simultaneously focus on the community and the network of supports that might pick up where things leave off. In many cases, this was used as an intake process for a Healing to Wellness court, so at least that was the known next step. But to focus as well in that community on, so who are the providers and who are the supports, and what are the things that might likely follow from this process that engages the community of supports. And then finally, without pushing too hard on the data question, this was not a research project, but helping the tribal communities, both of them, to consider, like, how would they know if they succeeded? And what are the things that you would see in front of you, and what kind of changes in terms of outcomes might you be looking for? Better engagement in the wellness court, better graduation rates.
We did a nice job.
More focused referrals, etc. Okay, so if there aren't any questions now, I'll talk a little bit about the work with the Southern Ute community, again, which is kind of a work in progress still. And these are during the kind of open roundtable discussion with the larger group, we did an activity and spent a chunk of time surfacing the core values of their community and what they wanted, how they saw public health and wellness, and how they saw the goals of what would you be asking. And these are some of the things that they came up with, as the idea that wellness is about the whole person, not about just the problems that they're having. And so getting a sense of strengths and assets and social connectivity is a critically important thing. That the whole process has to be non-judgmental and welcoming, which can be a huge challenge in a court setting where everyone feels judged and not particularly welcome. It's not the most warm and fuzzy place to be. And that this idea of honoring an individual's identity and the uniqueness of a person and that person's family's connection to Ute culture, and not assuming that there's, even with the goal of making the work culturally relevant, not to assume that there's one way to connect and in a prideful way to Ute culture, and allowing for variation and interpretation of traditions and ideas and values. And that was a big thing that they talked about, in part because I will reveal that was a kind of a pretty heated conversation, that there is some conflict in that community, and how things are defined, what words are used for certain things, what constitutes, a positive outcome, et cetera, was quite a debate, and they arrived at this idea that they would be open-minded about that intentionally. They felt that a process of screening was important to map supports, and that you're not just finding out about symptoms and strengths, but that you're looking beyond, and you're looking to find out who is in this person's family and beyond, to talk a lot about strengths and goals, but not to shy away from blunt language. They felt, and I think partly this came from their having a chance to check out the work that we did with Yurok, which was perhaps somewhat more indirect in the way that they asked about things like drug use and suicidality and trauma. They felt a value was in this is to be bluntly honest and ask straight up about these things in the process, and not to be oblique about that. And another interesting thing they came up with is the idea that the trauma a person experiences, and there's so much talk about the role of trauma in driving the symptoms a person comes forward with, and the importance of understanding persistent and historical trauma, is to understand trauma in terms of the relationships that people have, and not as an event and specifically as an external factor, but to talk about trauma in terms of the impact on the relationships a young person has. And I thought that was a very powerful insight that this group came up with. So the process that they talked about is they really wanted it to involve family and community, not just a thing we did to the kid alone at a desk in a room, and that it should be focused on building ties to key family members, overtly trying to reconstruct in places where there were ruptures in family relationships, and that there would be an overt thrust toward connecting a young person back to Ute culture, that they felt, in their view of health and wellness, this is a key ingredient that they didn't want to shy away from, that this would need to be part of every plan, is to, on their terms, as I said, but for there to be a plan for connectivity back to the cultural experience of being a Ute kid. And then that it shouldn't be just about treatment and problems and fixing problems, but about preparing young people for next steps in life, and whether that's a vocation or driver's license or navigating relationships and pregnancies. It should really be about practicalities of life as a young adult, which is just around the corner for the kids that they're working with. And then the idea that the young person should own this plan, and that they should be coached to ask for the supports that they need through an intervention I'll talk about, which is sitting together with a group of potential supporters and talking about those needs directly with them as part of the SBIRT interaction. So we came up with a 3-step model that starts with the creation of, you'll see a graphic of it in a second, the creation of a wellness circle, an exercise that is intended to help the person articulate a visual view of the balance that they have of a number of key elements in their life. And this is reminiscent, as you might be thinking of the screening tool I showed you earlier with the north, south, east, west kind of life domains that Dr. Barchis and her young colleagues came up with. The idea to start with the notion of balance, and that this idea of a circle or a wheel was important to the Ute community. To, let's think of you in terms of a whole circle and which parts of you are in and out of balance. And I'll show you the circle in a second. Then to take literally this idea of understanding social supports and to map out connections, to describe family and family relationships, and who supports them, who doesn't, who could support them in the future, and to do this in a visual way by drawing it out in kind of an eco-map. And then the whole idea behind that is to let the person know that part of what they're doing is preparing to invite some folks to a circle meeting, which would be the third and final step in this SBIRT model, is to sit together and talk about goals and support, and to request support from certain people, and to kind of rebuild some bridges. So this is, if you're a social work trained, you've probably done these before. this is an example of a genogram, an annotated genogram, which is a family picture where the young person is asked to kind of draw who's who, to use some notation. Like you can see the jagged line suggests there's possible hostility between two people, or at least not a strong connection. There's a double line there that shows that Tim and this person, Emily, and Tim being a parent and Emily a kid, that there's a strong connection between those two. So to use this as a way of visualizing the system that this young person is embedded in, and to understand, sort of the emotional feeling and who's supporting, and it's a living picture of the family that is then used to think about, how can we involve folks in supporting you going forward. And then the idea of the eco-map is, this is just imagine what I just showed you before in the center of this oval, is to understand that there is a system of support outside of your family, and to get the kids thinking about that larger world and to draw that as well. So, and this is an example of the wellness circle, as they decided to call it, that these are the domains: physical health, emotional well-being and coping, relationships and connectedness, the role that substances play in their lives, their goals, strengths, and skills, and their connection to Ute culture and spirituality. And this image is an image in perfect balance. It's meant to be an illustration, but you could imagine through discussion with a young person who might say, I'm not coping very well, and I'm just not feeling well, and that piece of the wellness circle might be represented as being small. Substances, if they're being used as a coping strategy, or they're being overused or playing a dominant role in a person's life, you could see that piece of that wedge of the wellness circle being represented as being too big and overshadowing some of the other pieces. And so the discussion with the young person is about achieving balance. After the wheel is talked about, not to push them to say, how are we going to get you looking perfect in your wheel, but to get them into a dialogue about the concept of balance and where they might need some support in order to bring their wellness wheel back into balance. And so the referral step to this, the RT in SBIRT, is this idea that it really needs to reflect the whole person, and it needs to reflect what was derived from the young person's own self-expressed representation in their wellness circle. That you wouldn't do the exercise and then create a referral that was insensitive to what came up. And it's a way of getting the young person to really articulate what they need, and then saying to them, would a plan for getting your circle into balance, would you think it would be valuable if we addressed the substances this way, or how about we think about your connectedness to Ute culture, and what can we do, and what's a cool plan we could come up with to build the referral directly derived from this circle, and to include elements of skills and that concept, that priority that they placed on preparing a young person for adulthood. And then this notion of shared accountability. I mean, we're very good, meaning I think we're very bad in general at making it the sole responsibility, accountability as this concept that a young person has to endure and suffer on their own and in a court setting, but to be very clear that the view of accountability is a shared one, that it's a community responsibility. And that's what the construction of this support circle is about, is to communicate that in a literal fashion, is to ask who could help hold responsibility along with the young person for making this kid's circle come into greater balance. And then in the case of the judge who was there at the time that we developed this phase of the work, Judge Chantel Cloud, was the idea that not to be shy once a plan was made, to court mandate that and make that part of what it means to complete healing to wellness court. So kind of a time check right now, and Precious, feel free to chime in. I have next queued up the example of our work with Yurok, but are there any questions? Perhaps we could stop for a minute and see if folks have some feedback or questions about the work we've talked about so far?
Evan, this is Precious. I have a question.
Sure.
How did the Yurok and Southern Ute decide who was on the planning team?
Well, we did some preliminary work, excuse me, and discussion with folks before we came and visited. And I would just say that this work is not done by remote control. This work is done by sitting around and kind of getting to know each other and talking in person. And part of the TA and the development involves visiting. So in preparation for that, there was lots of discussion about getting a balanced group of stakeholders to the table and asking them who's important to your conception of public health and the practice of your wellness court. And they made the selection themselves of who would come. And in both cases, with Yurok and with Ute, it became a very balanced invitation of folks from community, from various agencies, and from the court, and started with a big group and then got down to our smaller design team after that.
Great, and we have a question from Aaron Wilkinson. Say, what were your strengths and challenges in engaging the family members into the youth circle and wellness court?
Well, I think I have found in my other work around using SBIRT as an entree and an invitation for family members. And one of the judges that we have worked with is on this call right now, if he's still on, is that this idea of using something like this as an authentic invitation to let a family know we really value your participation. You have been invited into a very important and authentic part of a process that's going to dictate the way your young person gets through this little bit of legal hot water they're in and gets to a point of wellness. When you communicate to a family in a real way that you want to share this process with them, then it opens incredible doors in terms of involvement, engagement. We in the field of juvenile justice have been really bad at engaging families because I don't think we've issued the invitation in a way that feels like we're interested in their input and in understanding them on their own time. And we do it in a way that's either about checking a box or intimidating and mandating and requiring a certain view of participation. But if you say to a family, I'm all ears, I appreciate your importance, and I'd like to hear from you, and we're gonna sit down in a process that's really going to lead to a next step, you'd be amazed at the kind of motivation and connection that you get. We've just historically just been so kind of superficial and bad at this. But I think, since the question was framed as what are the challenges, is I think families are not used to this, and they don't necessarily trust that we mean it when we say you are a participant, an important decision maker and participant in a process. I think historically the courts have not really conveyed that message in a way that is trusted, and I think you have that conversation. It's like, I know you probably haven't been handled this way before. You probably don't trust me, but we mean it. So I think it requires a certain level of directness and honesty. Other questions?
I guess I have a question regarding this slide that's on referrals. How did the sites develop the referral partners?
Well, we started with, this having been involved myself in programs that lead really heavily with practices that are meant to unearth problems, determine what kids need without doing the preliminary legwork of inviting community partners to come in and play a role in the response and in the referral. It's a setup for failure, and it can be the kind of thing that really stresses the system as opposed to strengthens it. So part of what we did in the very first meeting, for example, with Yurok, is we asked them to invite all of the local providers of support and treatment, and issued an open invitation, and then following that went out into the community and attended some other meetings where other groups of providers naturally met and asked if we could come and talk about the project. So we did a fair amount of legwork in building support and buy-in from potential providers before we even designed the screening process. All right, so maybe I'll kind of walk quickly just to show you some of the diversity of what another model might look like, developed by another group. I'll kind of go a little quickly through the next example, unless we.
All right, and just let you know we have 15 minutes left, and that's including the wrap-up.
Okay, sounds good. So, so with the Yurok community, which is actually the first tribal community that we worked with, we were invited to collaborate with them, and as I mentioned earlier, because of a public health crisis, they had, in the year prior to the beginning of our work with them, they had 12 completed teen suicides. And it's a very small community, and everyone knows everyone, and it's a very, familial community, meaning they all really feel like family, and there's lots of extended multi-generational connections. So in a community of that nature, 12 suicides was extremely devastating for that community and traumatizing. And I think when something like this is unfolding, I think the feeling in general is that these things are unexpected and come out of nowhere. Although, as you begin discussing like the nature of, in general, what the youth experience is like there, feeling like they don't have a future, quite a fair amount of substance use, suicidal thinking is not unpredictable. But I think the concern was like, this is coming fast and frequently. And so I came into the process, I will be transparent, I came into this process thinking more like that first lens on screening, like that we needed to come in and help them predict who was potentially going to harm themselves, who was having the kind of symptoms that might be, leading in the direction of self-harm. And I was, now in retrospect, it makes perfect sense to me, but I was initially surprised and had my eyes open to learn that that is not what they were interested in at all, that they did not see the process of building an SBIRT tool with them as one of prediction. They saw it as one of connection. And when I came down, I said, I expressed my views that I know you must be, in a difficult position, and talked about how screening tools can help identify kids. They were shaking their heads and saying that is not our view, and that is not what we're interested in. We're looking at a way of engaging and bringing our kids closer to us and making them trust us. And that became the framework for what we designed. And they called their SBIRT model Path Forward. So they didn't use a circle or a wheel metaphor. They used the metaphor of a path forward into life. In the adult life, and in part because that's a meaningful metaphor in their community, but in part because they wanted to tackle head-on this idea that lives were being shortened and that paths were being cut off. And so they wanted to start the conversation by asking a young person, like, tell me about your life path that you are walking on. So that's how we started with them. And, we did a similar values exercise that I described. And again, at the very top, their top priority is they wanted a process that built a relational bond between the person involved in implementing this, asking the questions, talking about the path forward with that young person, not one that could potentially, put distance between them. And they said that straight out. They were like, we don't want anything on a piece of paper that looks like a questionnaire with boxes that's going to make a young person feel immediately alienated. And so the very first thing is, no paper. So, coming from a non-tribal setting and being a public health person, faced with the challenge I thought we were facing, this was an interesting curveball, but one that opened doors tremendously. So these are some of the values they wanted. Again, cultural resonance. They wanted this to be a conversation that was responsive to and was in the language of the way they talk about life, and not the language of clinical symptoms, et cetera. And they also were in favor of this idea of it concluding with a circle process with key supporters and not necessarily concluding with a referral. Is that the first piece of social engagement following the exercise of SBIRT was a circle supportive conversation with that young person. And so this is, again, apologies for the way the formatting kind of translated into the web format, is we came up with a 3-session process, and it starts with this conversation about the life path with a set of questions and prompts that were, not rigidly scripted, but were the kinds of things: who's walking the path with you? How long in the future do you see your path? Is there anything you're doing or taking into your body that makes it difficult for you to see the future or walk your path? How do you feel when you're walking your path? Is there anyone on the sidelines that you'd like to bring on and to walk with you? So a pretty fleshed out conversation about a person's life and their goals. And then a similar mapping exercise with a genogram as the Southern Ute group determined, and concluding with a circle meeting where bridges are repaired, a process they describe as giving and getting, where the young person is asked to prepare something that they're going to give to the relationship of the person that they invited themselves, and something they'd like to ask for and receive in terms of support. And so that's the model we came up with them. And so we're going to have, looks like we have probably about 8 or 10 minutes for questions, but I just want to conclude by reiterating the main thrust of this presentation, which is that culture and heritage and the community are really, I think, the most critical elements in this public health mosaic, that we put so much reliance on the tools that we use, the surveillance, the determining and predicting problems, and we put so much of our energies into that part of the wheel that's about fixing problems, that it dictates how we see problems, and we see problems when we should be seeing strengths, and that a shift in focus to something more balanced and on culture, I think, takes us a long way down the road of healing communities. And the process of adapting existing frameworks and models, again, SBIRT we describe as a set of elements or a compass that doesn't have practices dictated. It's about noticing, engaging, and then kind of triggering some sort of support or a plan. That if you do that, if you bring in a principle approach and allow a community to develop it themselves, I do think you are still maintaining fidelity to an approach, and it's a much more sustainable and satisfying from a cultural and community standpoint, rather than having chosen something from a list of tools or practices in order to satisfy a grant requirement. I feel there are ways of taking existing evidence-based practices and making them effective and more authentic. So I will kind of pause there and see if there are any more questions, but put in a plug. Here are contact information. That we have resources for communities that are interested in doing something like what I described and building your own SBIRT framework in your community and going through a process like we described and becoming the author of your own tool. That we have time and resources to do that in the coming year, and we're interested to hear from you. And I'll open it up for questions and maybe a closing comment from Precious. I'm looking at our chat box to see if anyone has a question.
Well, it looks like it's very quiet. But
I see a question that we kind of missed. Someone asked about whether we utilize the concept of ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. And I think that within the frameworks that we described, we certainly do. And we spoke about how, with the Southern Ute conversation in designing their tool, they had this idea that traumatic experiences and adverse experiences need to be talked about and understood from a relationship or a relational standpoint. And I think the field has become, certainly sensitized to ACEs and trauma, but I think that there's a wrong way to ask about it. I think that to uncover that a terrible trauma has happened or that someone is traumatized is not sufficient, that the conversation needs to happen, in the context of a person's coping and resiliency and the relationships that they have. So in my view, both of these models are sensitive to ACEs, and questions could be asked. For example, in the path forward, when you're talking to a young person about their path, you certainly could say, has anything happened that was sort of extremely difficult, or have there been some things that have been happening to you that are extremely difficult, that make it difficult for you to have strong footing as you walk your path? So I think there are ways within these metaphors to get at ACEs without a kind of an alienating in a way that might get kids to relive or re-experience them while you're talking to them.
All right. Thank you, Evan, again, for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with these two tribal communities. If anybody is interested in having Evan come out and work with y'all or just want to know more, please reach out to Evan. There's his email address. Also, you can request training and technical assistance from the Tribal Youth Resource Center at tribalyouth.org. We have a request form there, and you'll get a response back within 24 hours. And please take the time to fill out an evaluation for this presentation. The link to the evaluation will be in the chat box, and it will also emailed to all attendees. This is helpful in making these online learning events